"He is not yours." The words, spoken with the calm, unshakable certainty of a judge passing sentence, did not echo in the cavernous study. They were swallowed by the thick velvet curtains, the rows of leather-bound books that had not been opened in a generation, the suffocating silence of Blackwood Manor. They landed in the space between Duke Alistair Beaumont and his wife, Helena, and lay there, a dead thing. Alistair stood by the fire, his profile carved from stone, one hand resting on the marble mantelpiece. He had not looked at her, not once since his mother had finished her quiet, devastating monologue. The firelight caught the signet ring on his finger, the crest of the Beaumonts, a lineage stretching back through centuries of power and pride. A lineage, he now believed, that she had intended to corrupt. Helena felt the blood drain from her face, a cold tide pulling all warmth and life down into the earth. Her own hand, small and trembling, rested on the slight swell of her stomach, a secret she had come here to share, a fragile joy she had hoped might finally bridge the chasm between them. Now, that secret was a brand of shame. "Alistair, please," she whispered. Her voice was a thread of sound, easily broken. The Dowager Duchess, Eleanor, stood beside her son's chair, a sentinel in black bombazine. Her face was a mask of sorrowful duty, her eyes holding a glint of something far harder, something triumphant. She had presented her evidence with surgical precision. A letter, purportedly from a lover, found in Helena's writing desk. The tearful, coerced testimony of a young maid who swore she had seen a man leaving the Duchess's chambers late one night. It was all a lie, a tapestry of deceit woven with meticulous care, but it was presented as gospel. And Alistair, her son, the Duke, the man who had vowed to protect her, believed it. He believed his mother, whose word had been law in this house since the day he was born. He did not believe his wife of 2 years, the woman who shared his bed, a woman he treated more as a necessary piece of the estate's fine china than a partner. He finally turned his head. His eyes, the famous Beaumont gray-blue that could be so warm and were now so cold, met hers. There was no rage in them. Rage would have been a mercy. There was only a profound, chilling disappointment, a weary disgust. "My mother has made the situation clear," he said, his voice clipped and formal. "You will be afforded a quiet cottage on the northernmost edge of the estate. A generous allowance will be provided, on the condition of your absolute discretion. The world will be told you are in a state of delicate health." He was erasing her, not with a dramatic banishment, but with the quiet, suffocating finality of a name being struck from a ledger. She would be a ghost, living on his land, a ward of his charity, forever marked by a sin she did not commit. And her child, her son. "The child," he continued, his gaze flicking to her stomach with revulsion, "will bear a different name. It will not be a Beaumont." That was the moment the world fractured. The cold shock gave way to a surge of something else, something hot and fierce. It was the primal fury of a mother protecting her young. The nausea that had been her constant companion for weeks was suddenly gone, replaced by an acidic clarity. She looked from Alistair's closed-off face to the Dowager's carefully arranged mask of sympathy, and saw them for what they were, her jailers. The gilded cage she had lived in for 2 years had just revealed its true nature. It was a tomb. She would not be buried here. She did not argue. She did not plead or scream or weep. The time for that was over. The man she had hoped to love, the man she had married, was a stranger to her now, a willing instrument of his mother's malice. To fight them here, in their seat of power, was to lose. So she simply nodded, a single, sharp dip of her chin. It was an acquiescence that seemed to satisfy Alistair. He saw it as surrender. He turned back to the fire, the matter concluded, already moving on to the more pressing issues of estate management that awaited his attention. He did not see the ice forming in her eyes. He did not see the vow she was making to the unborn life within her. They would not have him. They would not have either of them. Helena turned and walked from the room. Her steps were measured, her back straight. She did not look at the Dowager Duchess, who watched her go with a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The long hall was cold, the portraits of past Beaumonts staring down with impassive, painted eyes. The house smelled of beeswax and rain and something else, something like rot beneath the floorboards. Oppression had a scent, she realized. It was the smell of old money and older secrets. Back in her rooms, the opulence was nauseating. The silk-paneled walls, the heavy brocade curtains, the silver-backed brushes on her vanity. They were all props in a play where she had been cast as the decorative, silent wife. Now she was the fallen woman. She moved with a purpose she had not felt in years. She did not pack. To pack was to take a piece of this life with her, and she wanted none of it. She walked to the magnificent rosewood wardrobe and pulled out the simplest garment she owned. A plain, dark wool dress meant for traveling, something a lady's maid might wear. She shed the heavy silk gown, letting it pool on the floor like a discarded skin. On the vanity, her jewels lay scattered, glittering in the lamplight. The Beaumont diamonds, a wedding gift from Alistair, lay cold and heavy in their velvet box. She picked up the necklace, its weight obscene in her palm. For a moment she considered taking it. It was her right, a small piece of what she was owed. But the thought of carrying its weight, its memory, was unbearable. She let it drop back into the box and snapped the lid shut. She took only one thing of value. From a small, locked box in her writing desk, she retrieved a leather pouch. It contained the money she had saved from her personal allowance, a pittance to them, a fortune to her now. It was the only thing in this house that was truly hers. Dressed in the plain wool, her hair twisted into a severe knot, she looked at herself in the mirror. The face that stared back was pale and drawn, but the eyes were different. The soft, pleading look was gone. In its place was a hard, determined glint. She was no longer the Duchess of Blackwood. She did not yet know who she was, but she knew she was free. The escape was terrifyingly simple. The house was a labyrinth of servants' passages she had learned out of sheer boredom. She slipped through the back of the house, a ghost in the shadows, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the stone floors. The air outside was cold and damp, smelling of wet earth and freedom. The moon was a sliver behind the clouds. No one saw her go. She did not head for the cottage on the north side of the estate. She headed south, walking through the night, following the road that led away from Blackwood, away from her title, away from the man who had broken her heart, and the woman who had engineered it all. With every step, she felt the weight of her old life falling away. She was just a woman, alone, with a secret child and a small pouch of coins, walking into an unknown future. And for the first time in 2 years, she could breathe. The years that followed were a crucible. Helena, now calling herself Mrs. Gable, found her way to a small, windswept fishing village on the Cornish coast, a place so far removed from the manicured lawns of high society, it might as well have been another country. The sea was a constant, roaring presence, its scent of salt and brine, a cleansing antidote to the cloying perfumes of her past. Her money did not last long. She found work where she could, her soft hands quickly becoming chapped and calloused. She mended nets for the fishermen, her fine needlepoint skills translating into a practical, income-earning craft. She scrubbed floors at the local inn, the harsh lye soap stripping away the last vestiges of her pampered past. She learned the rhythms of a different life, one dictated by the tides and the seasons, not the social calendar. She found an ally in Mrs. Finch, the innkeeper's wife, a woman with a face as weathered as the coastal cliffs, but with eyes that saw more than most. Mrs. Finch asked no questions about the sad, well-spoken young woman who was clearly running from something. She simply gave her work, a small room above the kitchens, and a quiet, unyielding kindness. It was Mrs. Finch who acted as midwife when Helena's time came. In that small, cold room, with the wind howling outside, Helena brought her son into the world. She named him Thomas. He was small and perfect, and when he opened his eyes, they were the exact shade of gray-blue as his father's, a painful, beautiful reminder. He became the center of her universe. Every aching muscle, every humiliating task, every lonely night was for him. She raised him in poverty, but he wanted for nothing in love. She taught him his letters, using charcoal on a slate. She told him stories, not of dukes and duchesses, but of brave fishermen and clever mermaids. But one piece of his heritage she could not bring herself to erase completely. In the quiet of the evenings, she would whisper the Beaumont family motto to him, teaching him the Latin as a sort of lullaby. Fide et fortitude, by fidelity and fortitude. It was a bitter irony, but it was his. It was the only legacy she could give him. Meanwhile, at Blackwood Manor, time moved differently. The days bled into one another, marked only by the changing seasons outside the great, grimy windows. Alistair's life, once so ordered and full of purpose, had become a hollow shell. The Dowager Duchess had won. She had removed the unsuitable wife and secured her place as the undisputed mistress of the house, but her victory was ash in her mouth. Alistair was a wraith. He performed his duties as Duke with a mechanical, joyless efficiency. He sat at the head of the long dining table, eating in silence opposite his mother. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It was a living, breathing entity, thick with unspoken words and festering regret. He had expected relief after Helena's departure. He had expected peace. Instead, he found a profound, soul-deep emptiness that no amount of work or wine could fill. He found himself thinking of her at odd moments. The way she used to arrange flowers in the hall, the quiet sound of her laughter he had once heard from the garden, the wounded look in her eyes during that final, terrible confrontation. The memory, which he had tried so hard to suppress, began to haunt him. The catalyst for his awakening came nearly 5 years after Helena had fled. He was in his study, going through old papers, when he came across the letter, the damning proof of her infidelity. He had not looked at it since that day. Now he unfolded it, his hands strangely unsteady. The handwriting was a passable imitation of Helena's, but it was too forceful, the loops too perfect. Helena's script had always been lighter, more delicate, a small discrepancy, but it was a crack in the foundation of his certainty. Then he saw the watermark on the paper. It was from a stationer in London that had not opened for business until a year after Helena had been banished. The world tilted on its axis. It was a small detail, one his mother had overlooked in her careful planning. But it was enough. The lie, so solid and impenetrable for 5 years, began to unravel. He thought of the terrified maid, who had been dismissed with a generous severance a week after her testimony, and had never been heard from again. He thought of his mother's swift, almost eager presentation of the evidence. He had been a fool, a blind, arrogant, trusting fool. He had condemned his wife and his unborn child on the word of a manipulator, never once thinking to question, to investigate, to show his wife even a shred of the loyalty he demanded from others. The shame was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. The emptiness he had been living with was not just loneliness. It was guilt. His despair quickly hardened into a cold, focused rage. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He had resources, power, influence. He had used them for nothing. Now he would use them to find the truth. He hired a discreet investigator from London, a man named Mr. Jones, who specialized in delicate matters for the aristocracy. He gave him 2 tasks: find the maid who had given testimony, and find out everything there was to know about his wife, Helena, under her maiden name, her married name, or any other she might have adopted. The search was slow and painstaking. The Dowager had covered her tracks well, but Mr. Jones was relentless. After months of dead ends, he found the maid. She was living in a small cottage in the north, paid for by a quiet annuity from an untraceable source. Faced with the Duke's investigator and the threat of legal action, she broke down and confessed everything. The dowager had coached her, paid her, threatened her. She signed a sworn affidavit, her hand shaking with terror and relief. The second search took longer. Helena had vanished without a trace. There were no sightings, no rumors. It was as if she had been swallowed by the earth. For nearly a year, there was nothing. Alistair began to despair, certain he had lost her forever. Then, a breakthrough. A chance inquiry by one of Jones's men in Cornwall, following a faint trail of a woman matching Helena's description who had bought a coach ticket 5 years prior, led them to a small coastal village. It led them to an innkeeper's wife who, when shown a miniature portrait of the Duchess, acknowledged that a woman named Mrs. Gable, who looked very much like the portrait, lived in the village with her young son. Alistair rode for Cornwall himself. He did not send an agent. This was his to face. The journey was a torment, every mile a testament to his failure. What would he find? Would she even speak to him? Did she have another life now? Another family? The thought was a knife in his gut. He arrived in the village as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. The air was sharp with the smell of the sea. It was a world away from the manicured lawns of his home. He found her small cottage at the edge of the village, a humble stone building with a slate roof and a small garden patch out front. And then he saw her. She was coming up the path, carrying a basket of laundry. She was thinner than he remembered, and the fine wool of her dress was coarse and faded. Her hands, the hands he remembered being so soft and pale, were reddened and rough. But it was her face that struck him. The quiet melancholy he had known was gone. In its place was a strength, a resilience, a hardness that was both beautiful and terrifying. She was no longer the fragile Duchess. She was a survivor. She looked up and saw him. Her body went rigid. The basket of laundry dropped from her hands, scattering white linens across the damp earth. Her face, for a brief moment, was a mask of pure shock, followed swiftly by a cold, shuttered fury. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. There was no title, no formality. He was not Your Grace here. He was just the man who had destroyed her life. "Helena, He had rehearsed 1,000 speeches on the journey, but the words died in his throat. All he could do was stare at her, at the 5 years of hardship he had inflicted upon her, etched into her very being. It was then that a small boy, no older than 4, ran out from behind the cottage, chasing a stray cat. He had a head of dark, unruly hair, but when he stopped and looked up at the stranger, his eyes were a perfect, startling mirror of Alistair's own, the Beaumont eyes. Alistair felt as though the ground had fallen away beneath him. This was his son. A son he had denied, a son he had cast out into the world. The reality of it was more potent, more devastating than any abstract guilt he had felt before. The boy, seeing his mother's distress, ran to her side and clutched her dress, staring at Alistair with a child's unfiltered suspicion. "Mama, who is that man?" the boy asked, his voice clear and bright. Helena put a protective arm around her son, pulling him close. Her glare was flinty. "He is no one, Thomas. A stranger who has lost his way." She bent down, never taking her eyes off Alistair. "Go inside, my love. I will be there in a moment." The boy, Thomas, hesitated. He looked from his mother's tense face to the tall, imposing figure of the man who stared at him with such raw, aching intensity. The child was not afraid, merely curious. He was a product of this harsh, honest village, not the stifling world of his father. He did what his mother had taught him to do when faced with uncertainty. He stood a little straighter, lifted his chin, and recited the words that were his only connection to a life he'd never known. "Fide et fortitudine," he said, the Latin rolling off his young tongue with perfect, practiced clarity. The family motto, the words of the House of Beaumont. Alistair felt the sound like a physical blow. It was impossible. It was undeniable. This small boy, This stranger's child had just spoken the soul of his lineage. It was the final, absolute proof that shattered any lingering shadow of the lie he had believed. It was the sound of his own, monumental, unforgivable failure. He sank to his knees on the damp, muddy path. He knelt before the wife he had wronged and the son he had abandoned. The Duke of Blackwood brought low not by an enemy's sword, but by a child's innocent recitation. "Helena!" he choked out, the name a ragged prayer. "Forgive me." Helena stared down at the broken man kneeling in the dirt before her. For 5 years, she had dreamed of this moment, of him seeing her, seeing their son, and understanding the depth of his mistake. She had imagined her righteous fury, the satisfaction of his regret. But the reality was a hollow, aching thing. His apology could not give her back the lost years, the nights spent hungry and cold, the constant fear. It could not erase the memory of his cold dismissal. "Forgiveness," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "You ask for forgiveness? Get up. You look absurd." The command was sharp, cutting through his haze of self-pity. He slowly rose to his feet, mud staining the knees of his expensive trousers. He looked like a prize bull that had wandered into a pigsty, utterly out of place. "I know I don't deserve it," he said, his voice raw. "But I know the truth now, all of it. My mother, she lied. She fabricated everything. I have proof, Helena. A sworn confession from the maid. Analysis of the forged letter. It was all a monstrous deception." He reached into his coat, as if to produce the documents, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "And you believed her," she stated, not as a question, but as a final, damning judgment. "You did not ask me. You did not look at me. You took the word of a jealous woman over your own wife. The proof you bring now is meaningless. The only proof that ever mattered was your trust, and you threw it away without a second thought." Her words were stones, each one finding its mark. He had no defense. She was right. His investigation, his discovery of the truth, was a selfish act, done to assuage his own guilt, not to vindicate her. "I was a fool," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Arrogant and blind. I let her poison my mind, because it was easier than trying to understand you, to build a true marriage." He looked past her to the darkened doorway of the cottage where his son had disappeared. "I have robbed him of his name, his home. I have robbed myself of 5 years of his life." "He has a name," Helena retorted, her chin high. "His name is Thomas Gable. He has a home. This is it. He is happy here. He is loved. He wants for nothing that you could give him." It was a lie, of course. She ached for the security she could not provide, for the future he deserved as a Beaumont. But she would rather die than admit that to this man. "I am not leaving," Alistair said, his voice gaining a sliver of its old ducal authority, but tempered now with a desperate plea. "I will not return to Blackwood without you and my son." Helena laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You seem to be under the impression that you have some say in the matter. You are in my home now, Your Grace, and you are not welcome. Go back to your empty house and your deceitful mother." "She is gone," he said quickly. "I have sent her away. She is confined to the dower house in the farthest reaches of Scotland. She will have no power, no influence, ever again. Blackwood it's just a house now. It's not a home. Not without you." The confession hung in the air between them, vulnerable and stark. For a fleeting second, Helena saw a flicker of the man she had once hoped he could be. But it was not enough. Words were easy. He had spoken vows to her once before, and they had turned to dust. "I don't care about Blackwood," she said, her voice flat. "And I do not trust you. Now, if you will excuse me, I must see to my son." She turned her back on him, deliberately and finally. She bent to pick up the scattered laundry, her movements stiff. She walked to her cottage door without a backward glance and disappeared inside, closing it firmly behind her. Alistair was left alone in the encroaching twilight, the sea wind cold against his face. He had crossed a country to find her, armed with truth and regret, and he had been dismissed as a stranger. He deserved it. He deserved all of it. But as he stood there, the Duke in the dirt, he made a new vow. He had failed at being a husband. He would not fail at penance. He did not leave the village. He found the inn where Helena had once worked and took a room. The irony was not lost on him. Mrs. Finch, her eyes sharp and knowing, recognized him from the miniature his investigator had shown her. She treated him with a cool civility that was its own form of judgment. He began a new, bewildering existence. He was a man of immense wealth and power, but in this small village he had none. His title meant nothing to the fishermen and their wives. He was simply the strange, sad man from London who watched Mrs. Gable's cottage from a distance. He decided he would not win her with grand gestures. Grand gestures were what had gotten him into this mess. The grand gesture of a ducal marriage without the small, daily work of building love and trust. So he focused on the small things. He saw that the slate roof on her cottage was leaking. He could have hired the entire village to fix it in an hour. Instead, he sought out the local handyman, an old man named Silas, and paid him a handsome sum to teach him the trade. For a week, the Duke of Blackwood, his fine clothes replaced with workman's trousers, learned how to trim slate and mix mortar. He climbed the rickety ladder and, with his own hands, painstakingly repaired the roof over his wife and son's head. Helena watched him from her window, her expression unreadable. He learned the rhythms of the village. He knew when the fishing boats came in. He would be there, not ordering the men about, but waiting his turn, and he would buy the best of the catch and leave it in a basket on Helena's doorstep before dawn. There was never a note. His greatest challenge, and his deepest desire, was to know his son. He did not force the issue. He started by simply being present. He would sit on the low stone wall that bordered the common green where the village children played. At first, Thomas ignored him, staying close to his mother's side. But children are curious. Slowly, Thomas began to watch the silent man. One day, Alistair was skipping stones across the surface of a tide pool. He was surprisingly good at it, a skill learned during a boyhood he had long forgotten. Thomas, captivated, edged closer. "How do you do that?" the boy asked, his first voluntary words to his father. Alistair's heart hammered in his chest. He kept his voice low and calm. "You have to find the right stone, flat and smooth, and it's all in the wrist." He showed him. He spent an hour teaching his son the simple, profound joy of making a stone dance on water. He did not mention who he was. He did not speak of estates or titles. He was just a man named Alistair, teaching a boy named Thomas how to skip stones. It was the most honest moment he had lived in years. Helena watched them from a distance, a war raging within her. Part of her wanted to rush out, to snatch her son away from this man who had no right to his affection. But another part of her, a part she had thought long dead, saw something in the scene that made her ache. She saw the patience in Alistair's posture, the genuine delight on his face as Thomas finally managed to get a stone to skip twice. She saw a father. The evidence of his mother's betrayal still sat in a thick oilskin pouch in his room at the inn. He had not tried to show it to her again. He realized she was right. It was for him, not for her. She knew the truth already, but the village did not. Whispers had started to follow Helena when she first arrived. A lady, alone, with child. The villagers were kind, but the questions lingered. Her name, he decided, must be cleared not just in his world, but in hers. He invited the village elders, the vicar, Mrs. Finch, the head of the fishing cooperative, to his room at the inn. He laid out the documents, the forgeries, the maid's confession, the ducal seal on the papers that made them legally binding. He told them the entire sordid story, sparing no detail of his own gullibility and cruelty. He did not present Helena as a duchess he was reclaiming, but as a woman of impeccable character who had been grievously wronged and whom he, her husband, had failed to protect. News travels fast in a small village. By the next day, the way people looked at Helena had changed. The faint cloud of suspicion was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective sympathy. They saw her now not as a woman with a secret, but as a survivor of a great injustice. Alistair had not restored her title, but he had restored her honor in the only community she had. It was a gift she could not refuse. That evening, for the first time since he had arrived, she approached him. He was on the stone wall, watching the tide go out. "What you did," she began, her voice strained. "Telling the elders, you didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said simply, not looking at her. "Her name is Lady Helena Beaumont, Duchess of Blackwood. She is not Mrs. Gable. I wanted your neighbors to know who they were living alongside. I wanted them to know your strength." They stood in silence for a long time, the only sound the cry of the gulls and the gentle wash of the waves. "Thomas, he asks about you," she said, the admission costing her a great deal of pride. "He calls you the Stone Man." Alistair felt a smile touch his lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "I've been called worse." "He wants to know if you will be here tomorrow," she said. He finally turned to look at her. The setting sun caught the gold in her hair, and her eyes, for the first time, were not filled with anger, but with a weary, cautious uncertainty. "I will be here tomorrow," he said, his voice thick with unspoken promises. "And the day after that, I will be here for as long as you will have me." It was not forgiveness. It was not a reconciliation, but it was a beginning. It was a small, flat stone, held in the palm, ready to be sent skipping across the water. The seasons turned. A harsh winter gave way to a wet, blustery spring. Alistair remained. He became a fixture in the village, the strange nobleman who had shed his title like an uncomfortable coat. He worked alongside the men, helping to repair the seawall after a storm, his ducal hands growing as calloused as theirs. He did not do it for show. He did it because he had discovered the simple, profound satisfaction of useful work, a satisfaction his duties as a duke had never provided. His relationship with Thomas deepened. They explored the coastline, finding crabs in rock pools and searching for fool's gold in the cliffs. Alistair told him stories of the Beaumonts, not as powerful dukes, but as men. He told him of the ancestor who was a scholar, the one who was a terrible poet, the one who had explored the Amazon. He was giving his son his history, piece by piece, not as a burden of nobility, but as a collection of family stories. His interactions with Helena were more complex, a delicate dance of advance and retreat. They spoke of Thomas, of the weather, of village gossip. They slowly, cautiously, began to speak of the past. He never made excuses for his actions, only offered explanations for his blindness. He spoke of his upbringing, of his mother's overwhelming influence, of the suffocating weight of his duty that had made him see his marriage as another transaction. "I never knew you," he confessed one evening as they sat outside her cottage, watching Thomas sleep through the open window. "I saw a beautiful, well-bred woman who would be a suitable duchess. I never took the time to see the intelligent, fierce, resilient woman who was right in front of me. I did not earn the right to be your husband." Helena listened, her hands busy mending one of Thomas's shirts. "And what do you see now?" she asked quietly. "I see a woman who built a life from the ashes of the one I burned down," he said. "A woman who is a better mother than I could ever hope to be a father. I see the woman I love, not the Duchess. You, Helena." The words, so simple and direct, struck her with more force than any flowery poetry. It was the first time he had ever said them. She stopped her sewing, the needle poised in midair. She did not reply, but a single tear traced a path down her cheek, and she did not wipe it away. The turning point, the moment the fragile truce finally began to transform into something more, came unexpectedly. A fever swept through the village, a vicious ailment that laid low both the young and the old. Thomas fell ill. His fever raged for 3 days. Helena was frantic, using every remedy Mrs. Finch could supply, but the boy only grew weaker. Alistair refused to leave her side. He sat with her through the long nights, bathing Thomas's forehead with cool cloths, holding his small hand, whispering stories to him, even when the boy was too delirious to hear. In the shared, terrifying crucible of a child's illness, all pretense fell away. They were not a duke and a wronged wife. They were a mother and a father, united in their fear and their love for their son. On the 3rd night, as the storm of the fever finally broke, Thomas's eyes fluttered open. He looked at the 2 exhausted faces leaning over him. "Mama?" he whispered, his voice weak. "Papa?" It was the first time he had called Alistair Papa. The word was a balm, a benediction. Alistair felt his composure crack, and he wept, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with the release of years of grief and months of tension. Helena reached out, her hand resting on his back, a gesture of comfort that was as instinctive as breathing. In the quiet aftermath of the illness, something had irrevocably shifted. The wall between them, worn down by his patience and persistence, had finally crumbled. "Come home, Helena," he said a week later, as they stood on the cliffs overlooking the sea. "Come home with me, not as my duchess, but as my wife, my partner. We will build a new life at Blackwood, one based on truth. Our life. For us and for our son." She looked out at the water, the vast, wild expanse that had been her sanctuary. Leaving this place felt like a betrayal of the woman she had become here. But she looked at Alistair, at the man who had humbled himself, who had earned his place in his son's life, and was patiently trying to earn one in hers. She saw the change in him, a profound and lasting transformation from an arrogant duke into a good man. "Blackwood will be different," she said, her voice firm. It was not a question. It was a condition. "The silence, the rules, the portraits. I will not live in a museum." "We will throw open the windows," he promised, his eyes shining with a hope she had never seen in them before. "We will fill it with laughter. We will commission a new portrait, the 3 of us, together." She finally gave him a small, genuine smile. "And Thomas will need a pony and a dog." "He shall have a stable of ponies and a pack of dogs," Alistair laughed, the sound full and free. She made her choice. It was not a surrender. It was a conscious decision, made from a position of strength, not need. She was no longer the frightened girl who had fled in the night. She was a woman who knew her own worth, and she was choosing to share her life with a man who had finally learned to see it too. Their return to Blackwood was not a grand affair. They arrived in a simple carriage, with no fanfare. The staff, who had been informed of the truth of the dowager's deception, lined the hall. They did not bow to a returning duchess. They smiled at a family coming home. The house felt different immediately. Helena, true to her word, ordered the heavy velvet curtains taken down, letting sunlight stream into rooms that had been shrouded in gloom for decades. The oppressive silence was broken by the sound of a child's running feet and the happy barking of a new puppy. Alistair was a changed man. He was an active and engaged father, a devoted husband. He and Helena worked together, managing the estate as equals. They used their influence not just for social maneuvering, but for genuine good, starting a fund to support the widows and orphans in the Cornish fishing village that had been Helena's refuge. One sunny afternoon, months after their return, Alistair found Helena and Thomas in the formal rose garden. Thomas was trying to teach their new puppy to recite the family motto, with little success. Helena was laughing, her face radiant with a happiness Alistair had never thought he would see again. The air was not stifling or heavy with the scent of cloying perfume. It was fresh, filled with the smell of damp earth, blooming roses, and the simple, profound peace of a family made whole. He came and stood beside her, taking her hand. It was no longer the soft, pale hand of a duchess, but it was not the chapped, rough hand of a laborer either. It was simply her hand, strong and capable, and it fit perfectly in his. "Fide et fortitudine," he murmured, looking at his son, "by fidelity and fortitude." "We earned it," Helena said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Both parts of it. He had been unfaithful in his trust, and she had found the fortitude to survive it. Together, they had rebuilt their world, not on the brittle foundation of titles and duty, but on the bedrock of earned forgiveness and a love that was stronger for having been broken and remade.